Okay, time to make the igniter for our model rocket motors. I start with Cat5 cable. This stuff is discarded by network geeks a lot. It's easy to find. Just look around a network installation. You'll usually find piles of it. You can buy wire, but this happens to be very good. If you strip off the covering, you get this core that contains 4 twisted pairs, nicely colored wire. These are a very good size for use with model rocket igniters. So I've taken one of these wires, cut about 1 foot of the green side. To make an igniter out of it, I start by tying a knot about 4 or 5 inches from one end, untwisting it, and stripping about 1 inch of insulation from either end. This is the end that gets hooked to the launch controller that delivers 12 volts or so to this end, firing a bridge wire. The bridge wire is a very thin wire that bridges between the tips of these 2 wires to create a spark. Okay. So come on in, let me show you the bridge wire itself. The wire itself comes from ordinary appliance cord. Here I've taken one off some lucky old appliance and stripped about 8 inches of insulation from one side. Inside, you'll find a whole bunch of these real fine wires. They're kind of grubby looking, but if you take very, very, very fine sandpaper and draw it across that a few times, draw it through a fold, it'll start to smile at you. Love that bright, shiny stuff. Okay. Once it's shiny, just pull it off. And this is enough to make 5 or 6 igniter wires. Okay. To solder the bridge wire, we start by untwisting them a couple of inches, and then pick one lucky wire and trim it off about 1/2 inch. Then strip about 1/8 inch of insulation from the end of each wire, and we're going to solder the skinny bridge wire between those 2. We start by wrapping it around the end of the shorter lead 4 or 5 times. Then I dip it in flux, find my solder, and solder it. Then I'll tug on it to make sure it's tight, make sure it got soldered. Yes, that one's tight and soldered. So now I'll twist the wires again, twist them back together. Once they're twisted together, I'll wrap this bridge wire around this longer lead 5 times. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and then on to the very tip several times around that. Once again, quick dip in the flux, quick touch on the soldering iron, and that's soldered too. Okay, quick tug to make sure it is. Trim off the excess bridge wire. And there's our bare wire igniter. It's not quite an igniter yet. This bare wire will make a small spark, but it's very unlikely that this would ignite the motor by itself. It needs some pyrogen. There are many possible pyrogens. My favorite is fuse paper. This is simply tissue paper, either paper toweling or coffee filters that's been soaked in a potassium nitrate solution and allowed to dry. I put food coloring in it so that I know that it's fuse paper. Here I've made one out of a coffee filter, cut a strip about 1 inch wide, and I'll cut a piece of it about 1 inch long, so we have roughly 1 square inch of fuse paper. Then I simply wrap this bridge wire inside the fuse paper real tight, and that makes our igniter. That's almost all it takes. But this might unravel by itself, so I'll use a tiny little strip of masking tape to wrap around the base. And there's our igniter. Let's see how it works. Okay, here I've hooked up this igniter to my 12-volt ignition system. As soon as I push this button, it'll send 12 volts to our igniter. Let's see what happens. Here we go. 3, 2, 1, fire. 3, 2, 1, fire. 3, 2, 1, fire.